Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, project of Scriptura. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 133. These are issues that anyone who's doing serious study of the psalm is going to encounter, is going to have to deal with, and each of these 3 issues impacts how you understand the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 133, the top 3 issues are the meaning of dwelling together in verse 1, the question of what exactly is flowing down at the end of verse 2, and the function and scope of key in verse 3. How does this last sentence in the psalm, which begins with key, how does it relate to the rest of the psalm? The first of our top exegetical issues in Psalm 133 is the meaning of dwelling together in verse 1. So the psalm begins, "Look how good and how delightful is brothers dwelling even together." And the whole psalm is really a celebration of brothers dwelling together. And so in order to understand the psalm, it's crucial that we have a clear understanding of what exactly this first line is referring to. What is it that's being celebrated in this psalm? And there are at least 3 options. Brothers dwelling together could refer to family unity, national unity, or communal worship in Jerusalem. First, some have argued that the phrase brothers dwelling together refers to family unity. And a good case can be made for this view because this is what the phrase means elsewhere in the Bible. There's a passage in Deuteronomy that says, "If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger." In this passage, the Hebrew phrase translated brothers dwell together is Yeshavu Achim Yachdav. This wording here in Deuteronomy is very similar to what we find in Psalm 133. In Psalm 133, the Hebrew text is Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. So in both Psalm 133 and Deuteronomy 25, we have the same verb for dwelling, Yashav, the same word for brothers, Achim, and a similar word for together, Yachad and Yachdav. In Deuteronomy 25, the phrase refers to literal brothers living together on the same piece of property. And so it could be that Psalm 133, which uses the same language, or at least very similar language, is also about family unity, about biological brothers literally dwelling together. But the problem with this view is that it doesn't really fit the context. Psalm 133 ends by talking about Zion as the place where the Lord has commanded his blessing. So if verse 1 is about family unity, and the psalm is a celebration of family unity, then it's not really clear why the psalm goes on in verse 3 to talk about Zion as the place of God's blessing. And not only does the family unity view not really work in the context of the psalm, it doesn't really fit the wider context of the Psalter and of the surrounding psalms. It would be odd at this point in the Psalter, near the conclusion of the Songs of Ascents, to celebrate something like family unity. And so others have argued that the psalm is not about brothers literally dwelling together, but instead, this picture of family unity is a metaphor for national unity. Literal brothers dwelling together on an undivided piece of property is a picture of the whole nation, Israel and Judah, dwelling together as a single, united, or reunited kingdom, with Zion as its center. Now, this interpretation makes more sense in the context. It explains, for example, the emphasis on Zion in verse 3 being the political and religious center of the unified nation. It also makes better sense in the context of the Psalter. The previous psalm, for example, Psalm 132, was about national restoration and about the perpetuation of David's dynasty in Zion. And this view also makes sense of some of the imagery in the psalm. Verse 3, for example, mentions the dew of Mount Hermon, a mountain in the far north, flowing down onto Mount Zion in the south. This would be a nice picture of national unity. And lastly, if you were to assume a later date for this psalm, then this view would make sense against the background of certain prophecies. For example, the prophet Jeremiah says that the Lord is going to restore the northern tribes, and that there will be a day when watchmen cry out on the hills of Ephraim, "Come, let us go up to Zion, to the Lord our God." So according to Jeremiah, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they're going to be reunified, and the people in the north are going to come to Zion, to Jerusalem in the south, to worship the Lord. It could be that Psalm 133 is a poetic celebration of this national reunification. The third interpretation understands the dwelling together in verse 1 as brothers dwelling together in Zion during one of the annual feasts. This view prioritizes the psalm's superscription, a song of ascents, and it understands this superscription to refer to the regular ascents to Jerusalem that Israelite pilgrims would make year after year. And this view also works well with the rest of the psalm. The psalm ends, as we've seen, by mentioning Zion and saying, there in Zion, that's where the Lord has sent his blessing. And so the basic argument of the psalm seems to be that brothers dwelling together is good and delightful because there, on Zion, is where the Lord has commanded his blessing. And that argument only makes sense if the place where the brothers are dwelling together, in verse 1, is Zion. So brothers dwell together in Zion at one of the annual feasts, and as they do, they experience the Lord's blessing because Zion is the place where he has ordained his blessing. So in other words, the third view interprets brothers dwelling together as pilgrims in Zion. And we think that this third view best accounts for the psalm's superscription and its overall logic. But note that this view isn't incompatible with the second view, which sees the psalm as a celebration of national unity. It could be that the psalm describes brothers dwelling together in Zion to celebrate a feast, but that this gathering includes all of God's people, Israel and Judah, and that it represents the fulfillment of prophecies like Jeremiah 31, where the watchmen on the hills of Ephraim say, "Come, let's go up to Zion." And so we might not have to choose between the three main views presented here. It could be that the psalm uses the language of family unity as a metaphor for national unity, and that this national unity finds its clearest expression in a communal gathering at Zion. But if we had to choose, we would interpret brothers dwelling together as specifically brothers dwelling together in Zion to celebrate a feast. And if asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest and D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a C rating. The second issue for Psalm 133 is in the second verse. This verse says that brothers dwelling together is like the good oil on the head, flowing down onto the beard of Aaron, which flows down onto the collar of his garments. And the issue here is in the last clause, which flows down onto the collar of his garments. And the question is, what is flowing down onto the collar of Aaron's garments? Is it his beard or is it the oil? According to the King James Version, it's Aaron's beard that flows down to the collar of his garments. It is like the precious ointment upon the head that ran down upon the beard, even Aaron's beard that went down to the skirts of his garments. But according to the net, it's the oil that flows down. It's like fine oil poured on the head, which flows down the beard, Aaron's beard, and then flows down his garments. And good arguments can be made for both of these views. The beard view makes sense because beard is the word that immediately precedes the relative pronoun, the beard of Aaron, which flows down on the collar of his garments. And it's possible in biblical Hebrew to talk about something going down or flowing down, even if that thing is not actually moving. So there's a passage in Joshua, for example, describing a land boundary that circles west of Baalah to Mount Seir, passes along to the northern shoulder of Mount Yearim, and then goes down to Beit Shemesh and passes along by Timnah. The boundary itself is not actually moving, but it's being described as though it was. And in the same way, it wouldn't be a problem to talk about a beard going down or flowing down. But then there are good arguments for the oil interpretation as well. So in the first place, oil was the subject of the same verb in the previous clause, like the good oil on the head flowing down onto the beard. And so it makes sense that in the next clause, which has the same verb flowing down, the subject would stay the same. It would continue to be oil that flows down. And another argument supporting this interpretation is that the next verse, verse 3, is also about a liquid flowing down, like the dew of Hermon, which flows down onto the hills of Zion. And so all of the other instances of the verb flowing down in this psalm, and there are 3 total, are about a liquid flowing down. And so it would suit the context nicely if this middle occurrence of the verb in verse 2 were also describing the flowing of a liquid. In the end, though, the deciding factor between these two interpretations, beard versus oil, is the division of the lines. So some have argued that the main division in this verse is between the two occurrences of the word for beard. Like the good oil on the head flowing down onto the beard, pause. The beard of Aaron, which flows down onto the collar of his garments. And if we divide the verse like this, then the question is really resolved. The phrase, which flows down, in the second half of the verse would most naturally refer to the beard of Aaron. But it's also possible to divide the verse into 3 lines, like this. Like the good oil on the head, flowing down onto the beard of Aaron, which flows down onto the collar of his garments. So according to this threefold division, either interpretation is possible, but the oil interpretation would seem more likely. The first line describes the good oil on the head, and the second and third lines describe the progressive descent of the oil, first flowing down onto the beard of Aaron, and then flowing down from the beard onto the collar. And this division of the text into 3 lines is how the Masoretic accents divide the verse. And actually, the strongest accent is placed right between beard of Aaron and the following relative clause, which flows down. And this division suggests that the last clause in this verse, which flows down, is not about the beard, but is resuming the description of the oil. The Septuagint divides the lines a little differently, but it also has a line division between the beard of Aaron and the following relative clause. And actually, the Septuagint clearly indicates that the subject of the last clause in this verse is the oil or the perfume, and not the beard. The Greek word for beard is grammatically masculine, while the word for oil or perfume is grammatically neuter. And here at the end of the verse, the Septuagint uses a neuter form to describe that which flows down, that is, the oil or the perfume. In conclusion, then, we interpret the relative clause at the end of verse 2 as describing the oil flowing down from the head to the beard and down from the beard to the collar. This interpretation best accounts for the line division and the predominance of flowing liquids in the context. At the same time, it's also possible that the text is intentionally ambiguous, or that there's a double meaning involved. Maybe we're supposed to imagine both the oil and the beard flowing down. But if we have to choose between one or the other, the oil interpretation seems to fit the best in the context, and we give this view a B rating. The third issue for Psalm 133 is near the end of the psalm, at the end of verse 3. The last 2 lines of verse 3 say, according to the ESV, for there the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. The word translated for is the Hebrew word ki, and this little word is going to be the focus of this last exegetical issue. The ESV translates the ki as a causal conjunction, for. But look at how the net translates the ki. Indeed, that is where the Lord has decreed a blessing will be available, eternal life. So whereas the ESV thinks it's a causal conjunction, the net thinks it is an asseverative or affirming particle, indeed. So the first question to be answered in this verse is, what is the function of ki? Is it a causal conjunction, for, or an asseverative particle, indeed? But look at how the net translates it. Indeed, that is where the Lord has decreed a blessing will be available, eternal life. So where the ESV thinks it's a causal conjunction, the net thinks it's an asseverative or an affirming particle, indeed. And so the main question to be answered in this verse is, what is the function of ki? Is it a causal conjunction, for, or an asseverative particle, indeed? And how you approach this issue, how you resolve this issue, will depend largely on your overall view of ki. Some scholars readily accept the category of asseverative ki, and they see examples of it all over the Psalter. In our view, examples of asseverative ki are few and far between. A recent study on ki in biblical Hebrew notes that the number of viable cases where ki has a clearly asseverative use have been reduced further and further throughout the past several decades of Hebrew scholarship to the point of disappearance. The present study has sought at several points to further demonstrate that a more careful understanding of ki leaves even less reason to recognize any so-called asseverative use. And the study argues that many of the instances of so-called asseverative ki can be explained as indicating a causal relationship. A good example outside of Psalm 133 is Psalm 1. Psalm 1, like Psalm 133, concludes with a line pair that begins with ki. And others have argued that the ki here in Psalm 1 is also asseverative, if only because the more usual interpretations of ki don't seem to fit here. But when we look closely, we can see that a causal relationship actually makes good sense. The last verse of Psalm 1 is grounding the entire psalm. The first 3 verses of Psalm 1 made the claim that it's the righteous who are to be celebrated, who are to be considered happy. And then verses 4 through 5 claim that the wicked are not to be considered happy, not so the wicked. And then verse 6 states the reason for all of this. It's because the Lord cares for the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will come to an end. And there are a number of psalms we've seen that end like this, that include with a verse beginning with key, where the key clause grounds the entire psalm. Some good examples include, besides Psalm 1, Psalm 5, Psalm 11, and Psalm 100, just to name a few. Psalm 133 seems to fit this pattern. It begins with a celebration of brothers dwelling together in Zion. Its basic claim is that brothers dwelling together in Zion is good and pleasant. And then the middle of the psalm, verses 2 through the beginning of verse 3, the middle of the psalm elaborates on this main idea, comparing brothers dwelling together to oil and to dew. And then the end of verse 3 grounds the claim. Why is it so good and delightful for brothers to dwell together in Zion? It's because Zion is the place where the Lord commanded his blessing. Another reason to see the key as grounding the entire discourse is that this last line pair poetically links itself to the rest of the psalm. So the word life, chayim, in verse 3 sounds like the word for brothers at the beginning of the psalm, achim, chayim, achim. And the beginning of the line pair, kisham, sounds like the beginning of verse 2, kashimen, kisham, kashimen. And so this last line pair in verse 3 is poetically connected to the psalm's introduction and to the beginning of verse 2, to the beginning of the psalm's central section with these two images. And so this last key clause in verse 3 has the feel of a final summarizing conclusion. It's grounding not just something in the previous clause, but it's grounding the entire discourse, explaining why it is so good and delightful for brothers to dwell together. And so we interpret the key in verse 3 as expressing a causal relationship that grounds the whole psalm. And we give this view an A rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The first issue determines what the psalm is about, whether family unity, national unity, or worship in Zion. In the end, we concluded that brothers dwelling together probably refers primarily to communal worship in Zion. But it's also possible, we saw, to see national unity in the background, the reunification maybe of North and South into a single kingdom with Zion as its political and religious center. Maybe the communal worship in Zion that the psalm describes and celebrates involves the entire reunified nation, and so it's an expression of national unity. And then the psalm goes on to compare this unity to good oil that runs down onto Aaron's beard, and then from his beard onto his collar. Oil is an image of God's blessing, and the image of oil flowing down and covering everything is a picture of the abundant blessings that flow from God to his people. And then the psalm ends with the final statement to ground its main claim. Why is it such a good thing for brothers to dwell together in Zion? It's because, key, Zion is the place where the Lord has sent his blessing. And so brothers dwelling together on Zion receive God's gift of life everlasting. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 133, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. All of our videos are offered free of charge, thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at scriptura.org to learn more.